Well, thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. Yeah, like Anthony said, native Canadian, so you'll recognize maybe the different English from yours. So please bear with me if I make some English mistakes because it is my second language. I am French. Well, I have to say French Canadian. A big distinction. So thanks to the SCTE for arranging this. Thanks for all the work that Melissa has been doing. I know it's very difficult to coordinate these things, and us speakers are not always on time in delivering what we're supposed to deliver. But yeah, we do our best. So like it was mentioned, yes, head of client acquisition, it's a nice fancy term to say head of sales, essentially. And for those of you that don't know Comsof, very quickly, we're a software company based out of Ghent. And we're really, 90% of our people are software engineers, very focused on software. This is my first time being on the software side of the telecom industry. I've always been in the deployment side. So indeed, as mentioned, if you have any questions or pain points, this is what I love to discuss about. This is what I love talking about. And every single FTTH project that happens around the world is very contextual. It's very unique. It has its own pain points, its own unique context, and this is what we need to do is deep dive into these problems and these pains to try to see what the solutions are. So today I was wondering, okay, what should I talk about? Well, before we go into those details, I'm going to try to see how this works. What we say at IQGeo and Comsof, we say we're here to build better networks. Right? But what does that mean? Well, building networks is a term that encompasses a lot of different steps in the process, right? So you plan, you build, you operate, and essentially you plan and build to give the network that you've just built to an operation and maintenance team. Right? So you need to build the best network possible. And what we do at IQGeo and Comsof is we enable through digitizing your business process with different software solutions that enable you to go quicker, faster, more efficiently with higher quality standards. I don't want to do a sales pitch today. That's not the aim of the discussion that I want to bring. But of course, you will see tie-ins into technology and how software can enable you to build better networks. So that's for sure gonna happen. But my father used to tell me, and you've heard this for sure, you know, work hard is great, but work smart is even better, right? So building better networks is great, but let's try to build smarter, not necessarily smarter networks, but building it smarter is what we aim to do, right? So you're going to see some Canadian aspects in my discussion today. I have to bring it up. So Canada, what are we known for? We're known for forests, we're known for bears, wolves, all these type of things, and maple syrup, of course. But I want to discuss a fable, if you will, which will tie into the discussion today, because I was wondering, okay, what do I talk about? I don't want to bring something to the table that, okay, everybody's heard before. I want to focus on how to better plan networks, but maybe specific aspects that maybe nobody here thought of before, or if you have, maybe I'll bring it or spin it in a different way, and maybe it's applicable for you, maybe it's not. You may not all be involved in the planning aspect of networks, but I'm pretty sure you're at least 1 or 2 degrees separation from somebody that is. So if I can bring to you new ideas, even one, I think the job will be done for me. So let's talk about this fable. What am I coming here to say for you guys to understand planning an FTTH network? Okay, so there's a story in Canada that we say that there's 2 guys that are hiking in the woods, right? And these guys are hiking in the middle of nature, it's a great day, and out of the woods, out of the bushes, comes a big bear. And the bear starts attacking. And one of the guys immediately, what does he do? He starts running, runs for his life. Second guy gets his pack sack out, gets his pair of running shoes, kneels down and puts his running shoes on. The other guy that's running stops and he goes, "Are you crazy? You'll never outrun the bear." And he says, "I don't need to outrun the bear, I just need to outrun you." Yeah? So the concept of this is what? Well, in FTTH networks, what do? We aim to go fast. We aim to build as fast as possible because we need to connect customers as fast as possible, right? So we don't necessarily take the time, take a step back and say, okay, before we start trenching and digging, what can I do so that the trenching and digging will go quicker and faster and better, so that I do connect my customers in a timely manner. So that's a little bit the story behind that fable. So planning is an essential part of what you need to do for FTTH networks, right? I put these quotes because I found that the three of them were quite interesting to me. They complement each other in a planning of an FTTH network, in my view. So by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Of course, many of you probably already have heard this before. I like the second one because, again, the Canadian aspect of tree chopping is there. So give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. It's also interesting, right? But the last one by General George Patton, a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. So I'm not here to tell you fairy tales about you need to spend all your time planning. Execution is key, of course. So the context of your network is very important. Why? Because you'll have to make decisions on when to stop planning and start executing. And that's the difficult part. And I get this question a lot. Kelly, when is it enough that I invest in good data? Kelly, when should I start doing my surveys to get good data? When do I start doing my designs? These are all good questions, but there's not one silver bullet here. There's no one good answer, right? So the typical FTTH deployment approach, what is it? Well, it's the just-in-time approach. You'll see I'm mentioning the just-in-time not supply chain related necessarily. I will make a link to the supply chain later and you'll understand why. But the just-in-time means we tend to involve the different stakeholders just when they're needed. And that's a big mistake, right? Oh, I need materials. I call up the material supplier. Hey, this is what I need. I need a cable. I need a duct. I need a cabinet. I need, when they're needed. Engineering contractors. I need my designs. Here's an area, design it. I need it by yesterday, right? Permit authorities. I remember being, during the pandemic, we had the FTTH conference virtually, also the Connected Britain event, and there were discussions around permit authorities and permitting and wayleaves, and it was discussed earlier this morning, and one of the questions that came up was, do you find that network operators come to you early enough in the process? And the answer was clearly no. They come to us too late. They should involve us earlier, right? And we'll talk about that as well. Material manufacturers and equipment vendors. I know I work with them very closely. I think some of you also work for such companies. What happens with them? I've asked them personally, what is one of your biggest pain points? Well, bad forecasting, inaccurate forecasting. What does that do? Well, it lengthens the supply chain. It takes more time, right? So creates delays. Why not getting them involved early? How do you do that? We'll talk about that earlier. So I put this image there because I find that this is what most operators do. They think of today, they think of tomorrow, and then the rest is, let's see, we hope. No, be organized, right? We need to be organized. So what is the aim of most FTTH deployments? Well, the aim is we need to start the field work. I like what was mentioned this morning. It's so nice to see the construction crews in the ground, right? Because now we see something happening and the neighborhood and the residents see that the fiber is coming. But how much work is put before that? We're talking about an 18-month period, maybe, sometimes 2 years. It's possible. But when you see them in the ground, that's when the real work starts. Well, I can tell you, for having been involved in so many FTTH deployments around the world, a lot of companies, their priority is let's get those technicians out in the field as soon as possible, right? And we overlook steps because we want to reach that milestone. You know, that JCB in the ground, that technician up the pole, laying cables, splicing, that's what we want to see, right? And that comes at a price. Plant your flag, that is a big aim. And it tends to happen here. I think the landscape here is we need to get there. I need to claim the land as fast as possible, especially with the AltNet situation. This seems to happen predominantly in the UK, but we've seen it in other places as well. Connect customers quickly, like I mentioned, homes connected, not just homes passed, but get them connected as fast as possible. Sell as fast as possible, because we need to start generating revenue, right? Need to justify the spend, need to help the investors, generate revenues and shareholder value. Shareholder value, we'll talk about it later. I remember this came up at the workshop I participated in Vienna. That was a very interesting workshop. We talked about shareholder value and how that influences our decision making in deploying FTTH networks. What focus is put for those aims that we see? Reducing the CAPEX. This is probably the number one thing. We need to save money. We need to deploy a network, but save money. We're talking about a cost per home, $1,500, $2,000 in rural areas. This is expensive stuff. Where do we save money? Well, the go-to answer is, well, it's the build that costs the most, right? It's the trenching, it's the ducts, it's labor, it's the materials. So let's focus there and try to reduce the pricing there, and we're going to be optimizing our CAPEX, right? And this is so important because what happens is that you have always planned versus actuals. When you plan, and then when you compare with your actuals, because your costs are so high, we tend to see a 20 to 25% variation between planned costs and actual costs. And what that does is if you go to the market and you promise that you're going to cover 100,000 homes, 500,000 homes, 2 million homes, if you think of a 20-25% variation in cost between plan and actual, something's got to give. Either you won't meet those targets and you have to pass less homes, or you have to inject more money and then you have to go back to your investors, right? So something's got to give. What else is focused? What else is there? Reducing your cost of your IT stack. What softwares do I use? What system of record do I use? You know, all this needs to be taken into consideration. There's a lot of money that goes into this. So these are just things that I've seen in the past that are the priority, but they do, operators seem to forget that there are other elements that can be taken care of prior to looking at this. I'm not saying don't look at this. This is very important, but don't overlook certain planning elements. So if you look at this typical process, if you've seen the FTTH handbook from the FTTH Council, they issued, I think, version number 9. I took that from them. That was a really interesting adventure because I participated in this FTTH handbook. It was really, really nice to work with the FTTH Council, and the new version is quite extensive, quite detailed. So I invite you to take a look at it. And what they did is they put plan, build, operate. Now, a very important part of the process is embedded inside, which is design, right? And we know this is a very important process. Well, I should say step in the process. What do we look at in this process is every previous step reduces risk of subsequent process activity. So what I mean by this is mistakes in plan will cost you much more, as you all know, to fix later on in construction, right? I can give you a lot of examples that I've seen, and this is what I'm going to talk about here. When you do FTTH deployments, it's not your business as usual. People are not used to having this amount of work in this amount of time. We all know the more work you have, the higher your risk of making mistakes. So this happens in plan, happens in design, happens in survey, happens everywhere, okay? And what tends to happen as well is that operators work with different business units. And in an FTTH deployment, you have all these different business units that are involved, or should be involved, I should say, but they're not always all involved. You have sales, marketing, you have sometimes planning is a separate business unit, design is a different unit. They all have their different directors, different GMs, they all have their different objectives. different constraints, different budgets, the process isn't streamlined. So what happens is that you have very iffy handover criteria, right? So what's the output of one business unit in the process to the next one? That becomes the input to their activity, right? I have a lot of examples. I'll give you one good example. I was part of a project where the operator had to connect thousands of sites, GSM sites. So we're talking, I think it was 7,000 to 10,000 sites. So around the country, big project. Now, the implementation crews, so the construction crews, had a target to finish X amount of sites per month, right? So bring the fiber to the site, and then the equipment vendors would then go in, right, and integrate the site. And the construction crews would claim that they would finish around 400 sites a month, which is huge, a lot of work. So their targets are met, they're happy, they're getting, you know, the fist bumps and you know, all the congratulations. But then the vendors come to the site, and 40% of those sites couldn't be integrated. So what's going on? What's happening? So these sites would go back into let's say, would go back into purgatory, if you will, and they started accumulating 2 sites, 20 sites, 50 sites, 400 sites now that are in this bubble. Nobody knows what to do with them. It's nobody's responsibility, right? And that was because there was an unclear handover between the implementation crews, the outside plant crews, and the equipment vendors. What is that defining marker, right? And this happens a lot. You really need to clarify what those handover points are. So what happened is they created a whole special team of professionals to look at these sites one by one and identify what are the problems. And guess what? They spent millions just trying to figure out what the issue is, go back to this site. So there was no do it right once. Yeah? If they would have taken a step back, looked at their process, make those handshakes, make those handovers, this would have been avoided, right? So the other thing is, as part of the business case as well, this comes early in the process, and we'll talk about the business case because that's one of the elements that I want to touch on, is the business case, when they do it, they don't necessarily involve the other business units, right? And essentially, I find that very odd because who's the owner of that network eventually? It's usually the operation and maintenance teams, right? And they're very far removed from that business case initially. And they should be involved from the beginning. You need that input, right? So you have to avoid, from the get-go, things going back in the process, right? And this happens all the time. We see it all the time. So what is often overlooked? The business case. Hey, good segue. So what do we talk about here in the business case? Well, essentially, you see, first of all, hold on. Is it business? Yeah, sorry, it's the network architecture. Now, the network architecture is a very big discussion. We could talk about this for hours. I don't want to bore you with too much technical details. But why is it important? Well, we tend to just go with whatever others are doing. Others do GPON, let's do GPON. Just copy and paste. But it's very contextual. You need to spend the time to analyze what topologies are optimal for my customers. What is optimal to operate and maintain? What will be easier to implement? Of course, what is cheaper? But is it cheaper for today, or is it cheaper for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? You need to do proper analysis, and I was thinking, what would I have loved to know when I was doing this years ago that I know now? And the answer to that is, I wish I would have had softwares to help me out. You have technology now that you can leverage to get those answers. You don't have, I see companies that do a complete design of an area, the full design of an area using one architecture, and then they want to compare with another architecture. So they use another architecture and redesign that same area manually. And this takes forever, right? Leverage automation, use different active components, use different passive components, test out the different boundaries of your cabinets, use a 288, use a 144, use a 96, see the difference, how many distribution points you will have, what type of feeder cables do you want? You want 144s, 288s, you want 864s? Test, see what the impacts are, see the impacts on cost. You have technology now that enables you to do this very quickly, right? And the other thing is continuously question the status quo. Continuously relook at your architecture, new technologies, leverage your vendors, leverage their knowledge of the industry, benchmarking, right? Compare to what you're doing today, and you can find that you'll save a lot of money in the long run, okay? What's the impact? Potential consequence, of course, reduced quality of service to customers, unclear design and build guidelines. If you don't have a set architecture or choices, you get designers designing every which way, especially if you have very large deployments. What you'll find is, especially if you outsource, that's even worse. Try to control, quality control, the output of what's being designed, yeah? More robust business case. If you don't have a good architecture, even from the business case perspective, right? The variation of cost between plan and actual will be larger. If you're already doing your business case with an architecture that you're already planning to deploy, your business case is more robust, right? You'll have less variability there. Selection of your materials. That goes after, not before. I see that often the other way around. Oh, I have my contracts with my vendors. You know, I get a special deal on 288 cables. This is what I'll use for my feeder cables. Hold on. It should be the other way around, right? So don't try to leverage the architecture to dictate the materials that you're going to require from the get-go, right? Again, your active network, your passive network. We're talking everything, ducting, subducts, chambers, handholds, manholes, all this stuff. Not just cables. All this has to go in the ground. All this is a lot of money, and from there you can already save a lot of CAPEX there. If you don't select your materials, possible consequences, challenging supply chain, talked about that earlier. We'll talk about what can be done as well in the business case. High cost of those materials. And then finally, all that flows down to design and construction guidelines. So you have your architecture, you've selected the materials, now you need to tell everyone, all your resources, how do they use that to design and build the network. Again, if you have proper detailed guidelines, you reduce your efforts on governance, all right? So governance, quality control, quality assurance, field inspection, quality checks in design, so on and so forth, right? So very important to do that. If you don't do that, again, you get designs that are not buildable. How many times do we see that? Design is made, it's really nice on paper, they get to the field, they go, well, I can't build this. So it goes back into the process, design revision, you know, oh, there's no ducts here. There was a duct in the design. How come? There's something went wrong. How many times does that happen? High cost builds, because now you need to find alternatives, longer delays, and you're actually not connecting customers faster, which is your initial goal, right? But now you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you don't even know it. And this happens a lot. Now, the business case. This is the other point I wanted to talk about. So let's say the big question I always get is that number one point here is the quality of input data, right? So what do I mean by input data? Well, do you know where your residents are? Do you know the addresses? Do you know what type of buildings there are? If you're deploying a network and I'm trenching in the ground, I want to make sure that I'm trenching once. I don't want to go back. So if I have a GSM site close by, if I have a a business customer, if I have a bank or a hospital, I need to worry about those right away. I need to include them in my plan. I need to get that data. Do you have that data, UPRNs? Do you have your street center lines, for example? Do you have information on areas where you can't trench, streets that you can't go through? Type of soil, do you have that data? Now, I discussed this in Vienna at the FTTH conference, and somebody in the audience asked me a question, and they said, well, to what extent is good enough, right? To what extent do you get, well, there is no answer to that. That depends on your level of tolerance to risk, right? So the more accurate your data is, the better your business case will be, which flows to the better your design will be, better your construction will be, and you'll do it right once, right? The lower your quality input data is, the higher risk you have of making mistakes, forgetting something, bad design, unbuildable plans, so on and so forth. Higher cost, variability between plan and actual. So there is no right answer, but it is crucial. Where's your existing infrastructure, right? We talked about PIA, but if you're an existing operator and you have infrastructure, is it well documented? Is it there? Do you want to survey right off the bat? Do you want to go open chambers and see if there's availability in the ducts? Should you do it in the planning phase? Should you do it in the business case phase? Well, at the business case phase, you may not want to open all your handholes and manholes, right? But you may have some critical areas, potential single point of failures that you want to choose to go and check those out, because it's a feeder route, for example, that will serve a very important area of the city, right? So these are decisions that need to be made at the business case level. Choosing your deployment areas. Choosing your deployment areas also very important. Again, I say automation, anyone, don't do this manually. There are softwares that exist, namely Comsof, of course, but understand that you need to leverage this type of technology to choose the areas that your cost per home connected will give you the best ROI, right? So you can do a phased rollout. So that's where it becomes interesting. You can say, I'll go to this part of the village, I'll go to this part of the city, and so on and so forth. But you don't do it, just like this. You do it based on actual information, on a proper GIS plan, with already a bill of material from the start. And you know, because your architecture is done, you've selected your materials. You can already generate automatically bills of materials that give you every single item, your labor costs, your material costs at the business case level. Isn't that what we need to make decisions? You have the data, so leverage that data to make better decisions. So it's very powerful. If I would have had this 10 years ago, that would have been amazing. But no, things were done more manually back then. But today, why fight it? I mean, I still see so many companies saying, I've been doing it this way for 20 years. Don't come and tell me that software will change the way I do things. It really does. It really does. Just don't wait too long. So in terms of quality data, I mentioned the consequences. I think I don't have to go through them again. But one thing is choosing your deployment area is very important in the sense that, your ROI, depending on how you're looking at it, if it's a 5-year business case, 10-year business case, or you're looking at it on the long run for 20 years, we're going to talk about that very soon, because that's also a very, very interesting subject. I'll just move along. One thing in terms of the business case here, just before I get into the shareholder value discussion, just to come back on the input data, another anecdote was that I worked with an operator that really had bad quality input data. And there was no way to capture that data other than do a survey, right? The question was, we had to do 2 types of data collection. One was buildings, dwelling units, how many dwelling units, what type of dwelling units, all this had to be captured. Then the second part of the survey was network infrastructure, because this was an incumbent operator and had already a lot of infrastructure, but their network records were really inaccurate. So what would happen? Do we, in the process, question, do we do both surveys at once? If so, when do we do it in the process? Before we issue first plans? When we do the designs? Just before we build? These are very important questions, and these answers are going to be, again, contextual. And if you have that pain, you have to really think about, should we do it? And this operator said, well, we'll get the building information because this is linked to your network dimensioning, right? You don't want to under-dimension and you don't want to over-provision because that's also too costly, right? And they said, but I'm not going to open any manholes. We were trying to tell them, well, you may want to start looking at specific manholes that are critical and at least open those. No, we don't want to do that. It's too much money up front. Fine. What happened? You can see the cost in construction go like this right away because they would open a manhole and what was in their records had nothing to do with what was in the ground. So everything was stopped. They go, oh, sorry, I need to trench here. I need to create a new duct. I need to place a new duct. I have no facilities. Well, there's a cost that goes up. And when you do 2 million homes or 3 million homes and 4 million homes, you start seeing the money go like this. And your number of homes passed that you had planned, well, we wanted to do 3 million, but with the same money, we're going to be able to do 2. How does the market react to this? Not very well. Not very well. Now, speaking of the market, the business case, the battle of the years. Why do I call it the battle of the years? Well, essentially, it's because the technical teams are working on an FTTH deployment. They're working on building a network for 20 years. I've taken this as an extract from the FTTH handbook, just on components, passive components. 20 years for ducts, ODF racks. 20 years for cables, distribution and drop cables. Feeder, 10 years. So when you calculate your business case, what are you calculating? What are you calculating it on? Is it 5 years? Because most of the shareholders and investors, they're investing, but they'd like to have a return now. Give me 3 years. Give me 5 years. Beyond this is too far. All right? So a lot of decisions that are made are based on this 3-year, 5-year window. But the technical teams are looking at 20 years and beyond. And this is the clash. This is where you need to really sit down, talk to your stakeholders, and take the best decisions. Now, I'm not saying completely on one side or completely on the other, but it is worth having those discussions, right, with your investors, with the shareholders, with your executives, and the technical teams, because the technical teams also have to understand the realities of the market, right? It's not just, hey, I'm putting a fiber in the ground and I need to make sure that it's going to work for 25 years. It is true, but there is a market reality that influences the way that we deploy our networks, right? So again, it's a touchy subject. Not a lot of us talk about it. It's something that we seem to, just put away and nobody wants to discuss it, but it is there. It is there. So let's discuss it. Yeah. Okay. So what's next? You're still in the planning phase, but you've decided on your network architecture. It's great. You've decided on your list of materials. Another great milestone. You've selected your areas to deploy. Year 1, year 2, year 3, so on and so forth. You even have an initial bill of material if you're using an automation software, like I mentioned. So you have all these things ready. You haven't started digging yet. You could, but let's see what can be done. Now, again, using automation software, we're talking about you have a GIS-based software, hopefully. It's powerful enough to give you these automated bill of materials. Yeah? Even at this stage. So I still hear from people that I talk to in the market telling me, No, this we do at the design stage. It's too late. Do it earlier, right? And as you move in your process, you funnel it down, and then you get more and more accurate. This is where I find it very interesting, is that now that you have all this, what can be done that will impact the delivery? First and foremost, permits and way leaves. Talked about it this morning. This is not unique to the UK, yeah? So in Canada, in Middle East, in the US, a lot of places in Europe, this is the major challenge, getting permits. If you have, again, that GIS-based business case scenario with your areas of deployment, with a time frame, you can use that to already start your discussions with the permit authorities. You haven't even started designing yet, but you're already sitting at the table with them. You can already coordinate with other utility companies where they're digging, facilitate that discussion, because you have something in hand. You don't just have a Google map picture and say, wow, we think we want to go here. No, you actually have your routes for your ducts, your cables. You already have routes for your aerial network. You can already show them, we want to put a cabinet there, and work with them and let them give you that feedback already in advance. Areas you can't dig, areas you can't trench. No, you can't go there because I'm putting new pavement in July. So you have to do it before July. Oh, okay. Yeah? So you do that in advance. And then you reduce rework. You reduce the fact that you, for example, you outsource your design to an engineering contractor. The permit request is sent. It's refused in certain areas. They need to find another alternative, and you pay them again to do that, and so on and so forth. That's rework. That's going back in the process, right? What else can you do? Well, at the Connected Britain event, I don't know if some of you were there, but all the well-known material suppliers were there. I have some good friends in most of them, so I use these events to go see them and start talking about the industry, which was really nice. And of course, the conversation around fiber shortage was predominant throughout the event and in my conversations with them. So in a world where we know there is, lack in fiber, what I asked them is, what do you think would really help you guys? And the answer was the same: better forecasting, more accurate forecasting of their material needs and when that will come. If you've done that business case, like I mentioned before, you can already, with that bill of material, talk to those material suppliers and say, look, this is what I see coming, and this is when. They all said, wow, I wish we could have this. Well, you can, but the users need to do it. The operators need to forecast better, leveraging software to do it, right? And then you reduce the risk of having backorder materials, or things are stuck at customs, or well, I'm sorry, your competitor, or I have another client that forecasted much better than you, so I'm going to prioritize them. This is what happens, right? So I think this one is a step that seems so obvious, but is rarely done, and it's really worth considering. You can create tenders if you have different suppliers. You give them that list and say, guys, this is what's coming. I'll create a tender and see who's giving me the best price, who can commit on the delivery, so on and so forth. Yeah? Same concept for engineering design contractors. Already you can create tenders. You can say, these are my rollout areas, my plans for the next 3 years. Who wants to design them? Yeah? So you can select your engineering contractors based on what you've already done in the planning phase, which is quite strong, actually. And do the same for build contractors, right? Some contractors may not want to work in an area. Resources is always an issue, not just in the UK, but especially in the UK. We know it's difficult to find technicians. So in advance, you're not waiting till 3 weeks before you dig. Who wants to dig? Who wants to come and build in my area? It's too late now. Yeah? Do it in advance. They'll appreciate it. They'll appreciate it. So that for me is the 4 areas that I would want for everyone here to at least know that this can be done. It may not be feasible in your specific context, but even if one of those can be applicable for you, you'll have a gain. You'll have a gain in your process. That's for sure. I'm convinced. So arriving towards the end, just talking about the main takeaways that I hope that I was able to convey. Spend time on selecting your network architecture, right? I think that's an important one. And continuously question it, right? I have a client, the incumbent operator in Belgium, Proximus. What do? They continuously look at their network architecture to try to improve it and save costs. Continuously. Yeah, they have a team of people doing that. It's really worth doing. Your business case, like I mentioned, determining factor of your project success. Don't overlook it. Spend time on it. Get it challenged. Get it challenged. Don't be afraid to ask somebody from the outside to look in. There are specialists in the market that can do this. Don't hesitate. We're not experts at everything. We think we are. Well, we're going to deploy a network. Hey, hold on. There's a huge process in there, and there's specialties in every single area. So stick to what you're good at, and what you're not, ask for help. But the business case is an important one. Have that internal discussion on business case priorities. That's the one that we don't want to talk about, but we should. Is it 20 years? Is it 0 to 5 years? Is it something in between? I think that's, for me, is an important discussion to be had. Do your resources know what to do and how? So again, are they qualified? Can you help them to do better? Do you have a strong set of guidelines? How to design? What are the rules? What are the materials that they can use? Do they have a booklet? Do they have a handbook? They need to know what to do, right? Again, because you don't have a lot of resources, the resources that you have may not be the most qualified ones. So they need help. The legacy approach to planning FTTH is behind us. Leverage technology. I've said it again. I hope it didn't sound like a sales pitch. It's not. But let's face it. We're in 2022. I cannot believe, and I still see it, people are still drawing lines on a screen. And believe it or not, some of them still on paper. This is mind-blowing to me. Leverage technology. Leverage a good system of record to capture that data, that geographic data and that network data, and work with that digital twin. The copy-paste of what's in the field on a screen. That's powerful. Leverage it. And don't leverage it just when you're operating the network. Leverage it from the start of your process. And then finally, get your stakeholders involved early. Don't wait until they need to deliver. Internal business units is an example. So get your other colleagues in other business units involved. So marketing, sales, O&M, IT, all of that. Get your vendors, contractors involved early. Material suppliers involved early. It's crucial. Don't wait. The more you wait, the higher your risk of not achieving your promises to deliver. Yeah? And that concludes my part. I think right on time. Yeah?
You say concludes. I think it's only starting.
Okay.
You were talking about technology
and
using technology to leverage things. Can you give some examples of how we can use technology to leverage this?
Yes. Now it's going to become a sales pitch now.
That's what I don't want. I want some ideas of how we can get the whole thing to use this leverage. There's quite a few out there that are trying to do this. They're using some of the same ways, LiDAR technology, going out in the field, getting Google Earth to help them. Can you just give us a...
Yeah, I'll give an example. If IQ Geo, for example, they have, well, we have, because we've been acquired now, so I'm part of the IQ Geo family. We have a solution where it provides already digitized process to do field walkouts, tablets, capture field data, can be put back into your system of record. Your designers, they use that digital twin to do the design, then they leverage Comsof software to do that design in an automated fashion, so you can do large-scale designs faster, more accurately. Let your designers worry about things that are important, decision-making, not drawing lines. Let the software do that heavy lifting. That's what I'm talking about, leveraging that software to do the things that are cumbersome, effort-driven, and are not the most interesting tasks to do for a designer. But let that designer analyze the output and say, oh, maybe if I move that there, that'll change. Oh, maybe if I change this route, it'll help me for this. Oh, I can't dig here. Run another iteration of the design. How many designs can a designer make? Usually he does one design and he does the best he can, and then he pushes that forward. Well, with technology, you can have the same area designed 10 times. So imagine the decision making. You have more data and you can make much better decisions. Yeah?
Can we just quantify this a little bit as well? How much quicker is it than taking a pen and paper?
Well, our clients tell us that they're 90% faster in producing designs. That comes from our clients.
Hi. Yeah, I had a point to what you said, because I empathize with an awful lot of this. A good long time ago, we were designing and building cable TV networks. We did have auto-generation of the location where our customers were with software analysis for the postal address file, for example. Yeah. We did have automatic bill of materials generated, albeit out of Excel spreadsheets of the time. We did have a sensible GIS system and an automatic RF design package. Fine. They were all great tools, and they reduced the error rate enormously. The most difficult thing, and I've done quite a lot of work since then in various studies elsewhere, was getting the customer to define what business he actually wanted to be in and how long he intended to be in it. In that, you could get a general brief saying, I want to build a network, but getting them to be more specific about what the network's target achievement points are sometimes very difficult. So you were given a sort of, well, go out and design me a network. And sometime later on, you'd come back and say, well, you didn't tell me you wanted the network to do A or B or C. You gave me this sort of loose cloud-like statement, which meant that a lot of blind alleys were explored unnecessarily, and inexact data at the beginning led to a lot of time wasting. And that's something which I think almost precedes the business case in terms of what needs to be done to make sure you know where you're at. If you're going to build handsome carriages, build handsome carriages. Don't build trains. It's just like that.
Well, the only thing I could add is I think, and you said precedes the business case. I agree, because just before you said that, what came to mind is I would suggest that discussion to be had in the network architecture step. So if you're deciding on your network architecture, the question is, what type of network am I building, and for what purpose? What's going to be the use of that network? And the network architecture is the technical way to achieve that, right? So if you're building just an FTTH network, pure FTTH network, just to homes, you may have a different architecture than if you have a hybrid area where you have businesses, cell sites, all these things. It's going to be different. You need to overlay these requirements. If I have a bunch of, let's say, key account customers that need redundancy, well, what type of redundancy will probably be needed in that area? Do you want to already plan this in advance, organize your architecture in a way that you can do that from the beginning?
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, so it is important, I think. Yeah.
Do I have to go around and pick candidates to ask questions? Are we at that level now? Thanks for saving me.
You made a good point earlier about spending the time before you go and do the manual work. But I think the problem is, if you had everyone on board with that, it'd be fine. But because of there are still a lot of people that think, well, if I get my spade down while someone else is still doing the theory part of it, then I'm there.
Yeah.
So then other people are thinking, I'd like to do this, but I can't do this because I know they're not going to do this. If they're not doing it, I'm not doing it. Do you find that's an issue?
Again, that has to do with that discussion that you need to have with the main stakeholders, what type of network you're building, for what. I'll give you an example. If your only objective is to build a network that you need to sell within 2 years, that's one use case. The decisions that are going to come out of this type of operator will be very different from the incumbent operator that is building a network for 20 years. Yeah? So this goes back to the third quote that I put at the beginning of General Patton, right? Which is, a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. In these type of cases, you need to work with what you're given. Huh?
Yeah.
So you need to make tough decisions, and you will probably not be building the best of networks if you're only building it for 2 years, because it's a 2-year window. So like I mentioned, all these things, ideally you want to apply them all. Is it possible? Not always. But if you can apply at least one of them, take the one that you think has the most impact on your end goal. Is it saving CAPEX? Is it delivering faster? Is it connecting quicker? Is it reselling your network to somebody else? Depending on what your objective is, I would select in priority the one that impacts the most that end goal.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I work in distribution, and the number of people that want something yesterday and the conversations you have about forecasting, it's just ridiculous. You think, hey, you've been doing the job long enough to know where you should be and how long you need to do it, but all the time, it's that phone call.
And the forecasting, I know I talked a lot about the forecasting in terms of materials, but also in terms of workmanship, labor. Huh? So forecasting the labor is also a difficult one. And if you don't do it, you end up, okay, I have my work plans ready to trench, ready to install cable, I have nobody to do it. And we see this happening as well. And I don't know, isn't that a very odd situation to be in? You have that work plan and you're waving it, I need somebody. It sounds weird to me. Can't you do that earlier and forecast better? Right? So if your priority is forecasting resources, then maybe leverage, a more, let's say, a more defined phased rollout to choose your areas, and already when you have that, go forward and talk to contractors and say, this is where we're planning to go, get a tender out and secure those resources, right? So again, there's not a silver bullet, but it's really worth looking at every single aspect of your process and choosing one of these elements, for example, the one that impacts the most your end goal.
More a comment than a question, but really just putting in context your point about 0 to 5 years and the 20-year time scale. I think certainly in the UK, going back to mid-80s, most of the people who started in the business disappeared very quickly, certainly the shareholders. That occurred again in the 90s when broadband really expanded. But again, you look at different companies, Videotron, a cowboy operation, I worked for them. But against that, somebody like 9X, which had the traditional telecom approach, and in fact, I think they worked for 2 years planning before they put a spade in the ground.
Yep.
Whereas Videotron, we actually put the spade in the ground and then a bit later on planned the rest of the network. But I see it occurring over and over. Every time there's a takeover, you question why the takeover. Is it about build? Is it about shareholder return? Are they looking short term or long term? And just to conclude the comment, isn't what all entities are doing now exactly the same? At some stage there'll be 3 or 4 major companies.
Yeah.
and it's mainly the investors that are actually doing that, knowing full well they're not going to be operating for more than 5 years.
Yeah, indeed, and that's a really good point. My take on that is if I'm an incumbent operator, or if I am in a position to buy networks, during my due diligence, I will certainly look at how that was built. And coming back to the previous gentleman's comment, if they build it for a 2-year window because they want to sell it, I may see that in the due diligence, and I may look elsewhere because the construction guidelines were not very robust, designs were not optimal, and then you're buying a network that you know you're going to have big operational expenditure to maintain for the coming years. And is that the network that I want to buy? Probably not, right? So is it going to have an impact on whenever we talked about consolidation earlier this morning, which is, I think we all agree, is something that's going to happen here in the UK? I do think that the buyers of the networks, the first ones that are going to start kicking this off, if they do a proper due diligence, you may see some networks being bought last for a reason.
Are there any more? There's always one.
Thanks. A little bit of a daft question, but one of the hardest things to sort out with network planning is what your network's going to be used for in 20 years. We run a small wireless broadband network, which has been running for nearly 20 years. In that time, our total traffic and backhaul capacity has increased 1,000 times. How can you get some software support to predict that sort of thing? Is there anything that can be done to get a better view of the future?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Not to my knowledge at this time. But technology goes so fast that maybe the answer will be different in 2 years only. It's very difficult to say. Now, today, we're building, the passive infrastructure is not the limiting factor in the sense that, if you have a fiber in the ground, your fiber is there. So, technology, speeds, the limiting factors are on the active part, right? And we know that the active vendors are investing so much in innovation that this is just going really fast. What's happening today and what's going to happen in 5 years, I think they will be the ones dictating more the pace of technology innovation from the active part. From the passive, I think fiber is here to stay for a while. I would be more concerned, honestly, in when you're planning a network, don't just look at the cables as your network. But your cables can't exist, your fiber can't exist without infrastructure to support it. And the cost of a cable is nothing compared to the cost of trenching. Yeah, so if you trench that 20-year window, I would look at it in terms of your infrastructure. Within 20 years, do I have enough infrastructure here to accommodate the potential demand of services and the type of services in that area? So I don't want to have to trench again. So make sure you have enough subducts, because blowing a new cable, it's not very expensive. And if you have a 20-year window and you have infrastructure, you should be fine. The fiber itself, as long as you can pull more fiber, you'll be able to give more services. I think the active vendors are going to be the ones driving that innovation.
Kelly, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for the questions.